How does one recreate the clothing of a cultural icon? And not just any icon, but one who inspired what is essentially fashion religion for modern minimalists. The answer is you don't. A while ago I made a video about Carolyn Bessette-Kennedy, what I believe her style represents to the masses today, and I basically concluded that what made her clothes special was her. It is not something that can be simply copied and pasted onto another person, and that is why Carolyn was and is so unique and special. That being said, modern women do try to replicate and emulate her style in their own way, myself included. But I'm not CBK. You are not CBK. None of us are CBK, and that is the beauty of CBK, that no one can do it the way she could. CBK made style personal, understood personal style before personal style really became something. She was her own personal stylist before the commodification of personal stylists. What she inspired in the everyday contemporary woman is finding our own sense of style, and not just to copy hers. Which is why recreating Carolyn's style was always going to be an inevitable challenge to make. Unless Ryan Murphy is certain that he's able to capture this aspect of Carolyn that is so integral to her very being, this show really should not have happened. I don't think Ryan Murphy really understands what makes Carolyn so iconic. After the test shots came out and drew all that controversy, his only defense was that they were simply test shots and that he was naive as to how much her style was worshipped. But this is exactly why he shouldn't be making a show about Carolyn in the first place. Now, some may argue that this is the fault of the costume designer alone, but there is a reason costuming has its own category in the Oscars, because a director is supposed to be responsible for the movie or show's entire vision. And this includes taking into account the costuming, which is part of the visual reflection of the story itself. Costuming is an important tool in storytelling. Think of some of the most memorable costuming in movie history. You remember them not simply because it looks good, but because it represents something about the character. I talk extensively on this channel about the character of a person reflected through their clothing choices. Yet fashion is often an overlooked art form because of how vapid it is depicted by media. It's almost always the antagonist who quote-unquote dresses well because they care about shallow things like looks, when the protagonist doesn't care about clothes, or even have to try to look good because they're above that. Which is why that famous scene in The Devil Wears Prada was such a breath of fresh air, because it openly criticizes this notion that women who care about clothes and appearances are not serious people or lack substance. Legally Blonde was such a game changer because it shows that a woman can care about appearances and be smart and career-driven at the same time, which is what modern women loved about Carolyn. She wasn't just some pretty trophy wife on the arm of some powerful man we are often used to. She was career-driven, intelligent, well-educated, and stylish. And it seems to me that Ryan Murphy is treating the fashion in his show as if it's an afterthought, when it should be at the forefront of the story. Ryan Murphy did not understand why people cared so much when the test shots came out. He does not see why we are so frustrated with the fashion. And to reiterate what I said in my last video, it's because it's all in the details. Details which indicate the care given, or lack thereof, to the clothes. Carolyn cared about the details in her clothes, and it shows in every single one of her outfits. Let's break down this test shot, which has been circling around social media, for instance. What is wrong with the outfit can essentially be boiled down to two things: the fabric and the fit. Two elements of detail Carolyn would never have skimmed on. The coat, whilst being a shade of beige, which has been seen on Carolyn or something which appears to be what she would wear, is wrong. The polyblend fabric, as opposed to the wool felt fabric often seen on Carolyn's coats, makes it fall on the body in a strange way. The fabric looks too thin and looks like it creases easily, a far cry from a nice, thick, good quality coat Carolyn would often be seen wearing. This detail is important, not just because Carolyn takes the quality of her coats seriously, but also because New York, where she lived, is a cold city, so a thin polyblend coat simply would not cut it for that type of weather. And again, it was something Carolyn thought about carefully when picking her clothes. It was meant to serve a functional purpose. Carolyn also wore a lot of belted coats. It was her signature, because again, they were more functional and shaped the body in a very flattering way. Which brings me to the second problem, the fit. All of Carolyn's outfits, including her coats, have impeccable fit. It's why she wore a lot of belted coats to cinch the coat in a way which gives it sufficient shape. In fact, the only time she did not wear a belted coat was this black one, and even then, it was fitted very well to her body. The black turtleneck and cigarette trousers do not work in this outfit. Not because she would not wear them, but because they weren't something she would wear with this coat. Whenever Carolyn was seen in a black turtleneck, she would dress it down with straight-leg trousers slightly flared at the bottom, like in this outfit, or with some casual jeans in a similar shape. The cigarette trousers, on top of them being ill-fitted and quite frankly way too short on the actress, is a problem, because it doesn't belong in this outfit. It's not impossible that Carolyn would wear cigarette trousers. After all, it is in line with that New York corporate attire, but she wouldn't have worn them this way. The only picture I've seen of her wearing something remotely similar is this one where she wore these beige cigarette trousers with a button-down relaxed white shirt with loafers. And speaking of which, the shoes here are a problem. Carolyn was known to have worn Manolos often. I believe these ones are called the Carolyn Slingback. I own 2 pairs myself in white and beige, and I love them. They're incredibly flattering and functional with the low kitten heel. But again, these shoes would not be worn with this outfit. If, say, Carolyn wore a coat with a turtleneck and long coat, she would either wear straight-leg, slightly flared jeans or trousers with ankle boots. If she wore cigarette trousers, she would most likely wear them with loafers and a relaxed top, and it would be during the warmer months of New York. You see where I'm getting at? It's almost as if the costume designer of this show searched up a Pinterest mood board for CBK, selected bits and pieces of what was seen on Carolyn, and forced all of these clothes into a singular monstrosity. This is not an outfit. This is a Frankenstein creation made from random body parts. Now, the final thing I have to talk about is the bag. And you're going to say, what do you possibly have to say about the bag? It's a black Birkin, something Carolyn was always seen with. But again, it's all about the details. People have criticized the Birkin for being a 35 as opposed to a 40. Why does this difference matter? Carolyn used a Birkin 40 because she could fill it with all the things she needed for the day running around the city. It was a bigger, more functional bag, unlike the 35, which barely fits a work laptop, and is something women tend to opt for today for aesthetic purposes, unlike in the 90s when the Birkin was actually used for functional purposes. Of course, that is not to say that the 35 is not functional. It holds a good amount, but the relationship people have with the Birkin today has changed. It's used almost for the sole purpose of it being a status symbol rather than it being used functionally, which was the initial idea behind its creation. Carolyn's Birkin 40 was heavily used to its greatest extent. It was filled to the brim and left open at all times as a result, unlike in this picture when it's closed and seemingly empty. It wasn't just an accessory on the arm. It was a utility. My point is, based on these test shots and what's been publicized so far, it doesn't seem like the showrunners understand the reasoning and intention behind CBK's outfits. It just seems like they threw a list of things Carolyn would wear together and hoped that it would magically turn into gold. So when you view all the recently published pictures from the production through this lens, it makes sense why Carolyn's followers are so frustrated and disappointed. So how can Ryan Murphy rectify this issue with costuming? Well, hiring the right consultant would be a start for one. Someone like Calvin Klein himself, or Narciso Rodriguez, who knew Carolyn and have worked with her, who understands the way her mind worked. This will not only do her outfits justice, but will also do justice for her character. In my last CBK video, I introduced the concept of style following the character. Carolyn's style would not have made the same impact it did without her character. The inspiration behind her style has to be internalized before it can be externalized. Which brings me to the other problem with the producers not truly understanding CBK's style, is that it's going to create a lot of limitations for the character. By lousily putting together these make-pretend outfits on an actress who vaguely resembles Carolyn, the showrunners are falling into a trap of trying to recreate this effortless image of a mythical goddess they believe fans of CBK would want, when that is not the reason people love her. Yes, there is an element of mythology surrounding her. She had a natural eye for fashion, but it was her job. As a publicist for Calvin Klein, her job was to curate an image of effortlessness often depicted in the 90s, which is why, as effortless as her outfits may seem, she dressed with immense intention and purpose. Fans of CBK know this. There are numerous accounts of people who knew her talking about her thought process when she put together an outfit. From the published production images, it's so glaringly obvious that they do not understand the essence of her character, nor do they understand the audience they are making this show for. Otherwise, it would have been reflected in the clothes. And I think the answer to capturing the essence of her character appropriately is creating depth, which is an aspect I'm quite anxious about seeing how it will unfold in Ryan Murphy's retelling of her story. because I saw how he approached another story of a fashion icon in the assassination of Gianni Versace, which also took place in the 90s. And what I'm most afraid of is Murphy treating CBK's character the same way he treated Gianni Versace's character. Granted, in the assassination of Gianni Versace wasn't even truly the main character, but rather the murderer himself, Andrew Cunanan. So it might have mattered less how Gianni Versace was portrayed. The point of the retelling of Versace's assassination was to tell a story about gay identity, homophobia in the 90s, and how it affects the machinations of a murder investigation. Now, I know American Love Story will probably have similar elements of Ryan Murphy's social commentary on the unforgiving and dehumanizing nature of the media in the 90s. But just my 2 cents here, I think Ryan Murphy has a tendency of letting the narrative and concepts of his stories get in the way of the characters. And as a result, it makes his characters bland and lacking nuance. And perhaps to Ryan Murphy, the characters are not the point, so much as the ideas and commentary the story is meant to bring to light. But there is a difference here. As much as Gianni Versace represented an iconic fashion powerhouse, it didn't define an entire era of fashion the way CBK did. There isn't the same emotional attachment towards Versace as much as there is for CBK. Even decades after her death, people will care deeply about how she is portrayed. Besides, the brutality of the media leading to the downfall of a known icon is not a unique concept. This was already explored through Princess Diana's character in The Crown. In fact, Princess Diana serves as a perfect parallel to CBK. Of course, the tragedy of Diana's death came directly from the paparazzi, but so many parallels can be drawn between the two from the scrutiny of the press and the public. The Crown was able to explore Diana's character as much as it explored how debilitating it was being under the constant pressure of the public eye. It added meaningful nuance to Diana as a person, from the perspective of the public, the institution, members of the royal family, the monarch, Charles, and most importantly, from her own point of view, how the confines of royal life and the institution crushed her soul. The Crown's greatest strength was its ability to allow the audience to glimpse behind the curtain, to lift the veil of facade surrounding the myth. I'm just not sure this is Ryan Murphy's strong suit, and what we're going to end up with is a surface-level portrayal of the character. I also wonder how John F. Kennedy Jr. is going to be portrayed, as much as I wonder about Carolyn. Because obviously, the focal point is not just on Carolyn, it's also about him. It's a retelling of their relationship. The Crown did a great job with Charles' portrayal, again injecting nuance into his character and his relationship with Diana. And you might think there's more to say about Charles and Diana's relationship given the absolute disaster it was. Unlike JFK and CBK's relationship, which was seemingly perfect, but there were cracks underneath the surface, as the press at that time were fighting to capture, with rumors of them being on the brink of divorce right up until their tragic deaths. Not that I'm saying you have to create drama to make the characters interesting, but it's more about the question of, what are you adding to this character which we don't already know? How are you going to portray the person and the relationship behind what newspapers and tabloids didn't already tell us? In The Crown, Diana's obsession with crafting a controlled image of herself using the press comes from her lack of control over her life and relationship with Charles under the royal family's grasp. It led her to essentially be conned into a tell-all interview, which, whilst we empathize from her point of view of dying to be heard, it also led to dire consequences of how some of the public viewed her as recklessly betraying the institution and putting herself in this victim narrative, even though she was victimized by the institution. It led to polarizing and controversial opinions from the public, especially in light of how they believed it would negatively affect her children. But that whole storyline was so meticulously portrayed because there was so much nuance from different perspectives. Applying the same idea to CBK's story, Carolyn also had a similar relationship with the press. But unlike Diana, she was obsessed with privacy and drawing up boundaries. In her 2024 biography, one of her close friends was cited to have said, "She became obsessed with not giving the press anything to find wrong. A hair out of place, the wrong color or fit of clothes, or having a scrap of dirt under her fingernails. There was a muting of herself, in her hair, body style of dress, to make herself less remarkable, less accessible, less newsworthy, both to the press and to the public, who were hounding her in increasingly intimidating ways." I wonder if Ryan Murphy will play on this fact in crafting her character, how the idea of her effortlessness and nonchalance, as perceived by the public, actually stands in contrast of who she truly was. Or perhaps it was how marrying JFK Jr. and becoming a public figure changed her life and changed who she was, how it effectively poisoned her relationship with her husband. A lot of these stories usually boil down to one's needs for control over their own lives, and the horror of living under the public eye is having that control taken away. It's what makes being a celebrity isolating and alienating. The issue here is, I think Ryan Murphy has a tendency of letting the overarching themes and bigger picture hinder the details in his characters. Not that the bigger picture isn't important, but details are what make the bigger picture work. Hence, coming back to my point that, in order to do justice to CBK's costuming, you have to do justice to her character first. And this can be done by showing the thought process which leads her to make certain decisions, be it in her life or with fashion. Of course, I am aware of the difficulty in portraying her thought process, given how much of that would have to be based off of hearsay and speculation. Carolyn was notoriously known to be a very private individual, but capturing the essence of a real-life figure doesn't have to entail 100% truth. 1, because 100% truth is basically impossible to capture, and 2, because this is fiction, not a documentary. I suppose CBK's diehard fans may very much disagree with this take, but I'm not saying that it is acceptable to subvert facts. I'm saying that a fictional retelling of a real-life story can include subjective opinions from the creator. In fact, I think it should be encouraged in order to create depth. A great example I can think of is when Aaron Sorkin wrote the screenplay for Steve Jobs' 2015. He famously said that whilst a biographer has a duty to be objective due to journalist integrity, a screenwriter has a duty to be subjective. It's the difference between a painting and a photograph. At the time, as much as Steve Jobs' diehard fans criticized Sorkin for painting him in a negative light, it was the depth and complexity he added to the character which made it compelling to the audience, whilst at the same time keeping to the integrity of paying homage to an iconic figure in a respectful way. And if you want more evidence of how well Sorkin captured Jobs' essence, Steve Wozniak, Jobs' longtime friend, was known to have said about Sorkin's adaptation, "None of it happened, but it was all true." So applying this concept of subjective creativity to recreating Carolyn's character and her fashion, I don't believe it has to be an exact copy, but it has to be in line with how Carolyn would think and act. Again, I like to use Diana in The Crown as an example. A lot of the outfits recreated in the show were not the exact pieces or copies, save for some of the more pivotal moments. Yet it still managed to be accurate to Diana's character and pay homage to how much of a huge fashion icon Diana was in the 90s. I read that for CBK, they're planning to replicate some of the pieces, such as her famous wedding dress, which is appreciated given how much of an impact the simplicity of the wedding dress made. But my point is, the outfits don't have to be exactly the same, as long as they're still true and authentic to Carolyn. As I mentioned earlier, what made the outfits in the test shots most inaccurate wasn't the fact that the clothes look like cheap Zara replicas, although that aspect does play a part in it, but the fact that Carolyn would not have combined them in such a way. This might be a more controversial take, but I think it's okay to use specific modern designers for the outfits, like the Row, Kate, Totem, Gabriella Hearst, brands I believe Carolyn would wear today if she were still alive. In fact, it might make an interesting storytelling device by creating parallels between modern times and the 90s. Or instill some of the social commentary Ryan Murphy intends to make with Media Frenzy, then versus now, about how we haven't really come as far as we thought we did, because the toxicity of media is amplified tenfold. It all depends on the choice of creative direction, but staying true to the character has to be the priority. So here are my final thoughts on what I think is going to happen. I think that the show is going to give a half-assed retelling of the story of CBK and JFK. Ryan Murphy is going to gloss over his characters the same way he did in some of his previous productions. And the depiction of the relationship between Carolyn and JFK is going to lack a lot of nuance, because based on past experience, he doesn't go in depth enough to paint a realistic portrayal of the person he's basing the show on. I think the events in the show are going to unfold the way the public know or are told of how they unfolded, but I don't see the show giving us any insider information on why and how they unfolded the way they did. It's always why a lot of these biopics fall short, because they're always afraid to really look into the nuances of a person's character traits and flaws, and the character's intentions with the incidents in the story, which in turn makes the incidents and hence story painfully one-dimensional. When it comes to a fictional retelling of real-life events, you either completely lift the veil or leave the veil alone. There is no room for something in between. If as a creator, you're not prepared to go in depth into a person's character, then it's best to let a myth stay a myth.